Good afternoon, everyone. We continue our journey on the leadership track, and now we have Mike Burrows, who has written extensively on how we can do a better job in organizing ourselves and creating the right form of management. Mike, could you say a few words about yourself?
Yeah, great to be here. Thank you very much. Good to see you again, Levent. So I'm the founder of Agenda Shift, the author of some books that you may or may not know. Kanban from the Inside was that was 2014. Right to Left, Digital Leaders Guide to Lean and Agile, and then Agenda Shift, Outcome-Oriented Change and Continuous Transformation, putting agreements on outcomes before solutions. Really quite radical way of looking at change. And I tell people that I've committed the rest of my outcomes, however long that might be.
So to reach those outcomes, I think there's a long journey on how to get this right. I think you have given a lot of thought to this, and you have distilled all of that into what you call the deliberately adaptive organization. So this is a very distilled product, right? It's a nice whiskey.
It is. I'm actually not going to talk that much about outcomes, but really about some of the taking some of the fundamental models of organization, and then integrate into that, things like my stuff, outcome orientation, things like, lean startup, deliberately developmental organizations, all those kinds of things. So we get something that's actually a little bit more accessible than those academic models. But it's also much easier to understand their relevance to modern organizations, to business agility, and to challenges like agile scaling.
All right. So if you like, we can, you have a long deck?
I have a deck.
A long one?
Fairly long.
All right. So let's get going.
I'm ready.
It's on to you.
I'm ready to get going. So,
thank you.
Yeah, so up and down the deliberately adaptive organization, business agility at every scale. Now, before I get technical, I want to start with where I was 13, 14, 15 years ago, wrestling with the imbalances. I was running a global department. I had teams in multiple countries, about 100 people overall. Some countries had just one person in it. Others had enough people that I had some team structure, team of teams. I was a manager of managers and so on. Different team structures in different locations and so on. And the structure kind of felt right, but it also felt interesting that I had such different structures in different places. To go with that size of team, I had, size of budget. That also had some structure, different buckets of budget that to a reasonable extent sort of describe what it is we were meant to be doing. But I had some wiggle room within that. I had customers, of course, internal customers, it should be said. They were distributed around the world. They had desires that did or didn't match up to those buckets of budget, and they needed skills that did match or didn't match to the capabilities we had in their respective locations and so on. Then I became a student of Lean. And I got really interested in the balance between demand and capacity. And you don't need to know Lean to know that to have more demand than you can cope with, it feels horrible and you perform horribly. Overburdened systems are a disaster at a human level and at a performance level. And the same is true actually of organizations, teams, people with not enough, interesting enough and challenging work. Psychologically at least that's devastating, and economically to the organization that's also very wasteful. So managing demand and capacity, quite an interesting focus. Different time horizons. So short term, medium term, long term. You can't only be doing the urgent stuff. If you don't pay attention to the medium term stuff and the longer term stuff, you're just building up more and more trouble for yourself. And related to that, delivery versus development. You need to do some delivery to pay the bills, to make you money, survive from day to day from a cash flow point of view. But if you're not developing as an organization, you're going to be overtaken by your competitors. You're not going to be ready to respond. You will stagnate. You will lose people. All those sort of bad things start to happen. And then there's a tension between the inside and the outside. Inside feels familiar and comfortable, and it's like a big bad world out there. What I didn't say at the beginning is this was 2007, 2008, the height of the financial crisis, and this global department was in a leading bank. And I really felt, I was in a storm there. Definitely the most challenging time of my whole career, and it stayed with me. And I alluded to it, talked a little bit about the context of it in my first book. But that idea of balance stuck with me. And it's one of the values of my values model for Kanban. I don't spend much time with Kanban these days, but my values model and the book that follows is my lasting contribution, so to speak. The second value and chapter 2 of the book is actually called balance. And it's not just about demand and capacity, those lean type things, but all these other kinds of balance and more. And then I got to my third book now. We'll skip the second, we'll come back to it. 2019, right to left. And I was starting to get very influenced by sort of academic models of organization and the role that balance played in them. And it definitely shows in that book. And then by the time of the second edition of my second book, so this is now early this year, I actually threw away the last chapter of the first edition and added an extra chapter. And I spent 2 chapters describing the deliberately adaptive organization. And what it is an integration of all we know about business agility, about agile, about lean, about organization development, which is a big focus of mine, leadership, human development or personal development, and so on, integrating that into this very scary looking model on the left. And this very scary model, it puts people off, people are intimidated by it. It's been around since the 70s. It's like the Swiss Army knife of the management consultant, a very powerful model, but it does seem impenetrable. It does seem scary. And that model is the viable system model by Stafford Beer. It's the crowning, well, in my opinion at least, it's the crowning achievement of the management cybernetics community. A model and a community that actually is somewhat misunderstood, and I will get to that misunderstanding towards the end of the talk. So, how to make this whole thing more accessible? The viable system model describes, is a model that attempts to describe all viable systems, everything that has the will to survive and thrive in a changing environment. And it's been used to describe teams, to describe companies. It's been used to describe industries, whole economies, and also down to a smaller scale of the human being and and other organisms even. It's a very powerful model, but because it can describe so many different things, it's also very generic, very abstract, and you'll be shocked in a moment at just how abstract it can be. But we can make it so much more understandable when we plug into it some things that are familiar. It makes it less abstract, more concrete, less general. But I'm not trying to describe anything universal. I'm just trying to describe the deliberately adaptive organization, and I get to choose what that feels like, what that looks like. We've used that scaling idea to maximum effect. So deliberately adaptive teams, deliberately adaptive enterprises, and between those deliberately adaptive teams of teams. And also the idea that we can scale down as well as up. So deliberately adaptive people as well. And at the end of the talk, we'll explore that idea a bit. So instead of that really complicated picture, I start with this sort of 10,000 foot view. And the way to understand this is as 3 overlapping systems. So intentful knowledge discovery, bottom right. So this is all about everything to do with developing knowledge, so experimentation, intelligence gathering, and so on. But not random experimentation that's guided by strategy and by purpose. And what we're doing, we're making sure that when we're doing new things, which we will be, when we're striving for new levels of performance, which we should be, when we're operating in new or changing environments, and again, that's almost inevitable, making sure that we don't waste all the opportunity there is for learning. If we're doing all those new things and not learning in the process, and that's not having an impact on strategy, then there's something very badly wrong. We're leaving a lot of value on the table, and there's every chance we're going to be overtaken by people that can learn faster than us. On the left, mutual trust building, and this is about everything we can possibly do to minimize the organizational cost and the personal cost of mistrust. So we're not being defensive, we're not hiding things, we're not duplicating effort because we don't trust other teams or other people to do what they say they're going to do. But we don't trust that what we think is happening is actually happening. So we all use all the usual mechanisms for building trust: transparency, early warning systems, collaborative problem solving, and all sorts of other things as ways explicitly to build trust. And at the top, adaptive strategies, that's incorporating that learning into strategy. That's something that means our strategy is continuously evolving. And it has a specific responsibility to do that time horizons thing, making sure that we're not just doing the work for today. We're going to be opening up new avenues for tomorrow. We're going to be in good shape when we get to where we want to be. We'll get to where we want to be, being who we want to be, if you like, and that balance between delivery and developmental activities. So we're going to dive into that bottom right-hand corner first, and you'll see why I am so fixated on balance in a moment. So what's the job here? Now, describing things that are pretty universal, we need, as teams, we'll start at team level, to be interacting with our environment, turning intent into progress. That's a slightly abstract way of describing it, but that's in the end what we need to do. We're committed to doing something, and we turn that into progress. And if we're doing new things, we need to be generating insights, framing our work for learning, framing it as experiments, and so on. So starting with Stafford Beer's terminology, first of all, we have the environment, which from time to time we interact with. As a team, and we're at team level here, teams are made of people, and people have identity. They can think for themselves. They have autonomy. They're diverse. They're all these things. Heads, that's representing identity and ability to make decisions. Hands representing their ability to do the work. Teams, to be a team, to be working as a team, there needs to be some sense of the intent. What are they trying to achieve as a team? Their objectives, their goals. And they need some mechanisms that helps them coordinate, keep things in balance, stops them tripping over each other, stops them fighting over shared resources, efficient protocols for communicating with each other, and so on, and so on. And if we're serious about knowledge discovery, then, as I've said already, we want to be framing our new work, anything we're doing for the first time, as an experiment, something we expect to learn from, and we're reporting back on the progress that we make as we do that work. From time to time, that's going to involve interacting with the environment, probing the environment, and seeing what responses come back. And we're going to feed back our insights. This is where we add some extra value from our experiments and from our interactions with the outside world. What are we seeing? What are we learning? What do we infer from that? And share some insights back. Now, one thing you will be surprised at, perhaps, is that these boxes don't have names. And here I am copying Stafford Beer. And this is where it gets so abstract. He was so worried that by giving a name to a box, people would misunderstand what it was all about. He just gave the numbers. So we're seeing systems 1, 2, and 3 here. The environment he was happy with, but the other boxes 1, 2, and 3. Now, I don't have the same problem that Stafford Beer has. I'm not trying to develop something universal, so I will give some names. So the agenda for change, that's the reason why we're doing the experiments we want to do, and it contains, a list of the experiments that we're committed to trying. And over here on the right, doing the coordination, there's a whole load of tools that I could plug in here. The one that best fits from the agenda shift world is ChangeBan. And ChangeBan is quite simply a Kanban system, so visual management and some control on work in progress for experiments. So with those work in progress controls, it's a pull system. We create capacity as we finish stuff. We're working right to left, title of my book. And we're optimizing for learning. We're making sure that every stage in the process, we're asking the right questions. And if this board design seems familiar to you, basically this is from the lean startup world. Via my friend Jeff Anderson, this kind of board will look very familiar in the lean startup literature from 10, 15 years ago. Change Band turns that into a simulation game. So what are we doing? We're turning intent into progress, and the other way around, we're turning experiments into insights. Job done, really. Describing some basic things that all teams need to be doing, and describing some particular ways of framing that. If we're doing things for the first time, don't want to waste the opportunity for learning. What makes this interesting and really powerful as a diagnostic tool is that you can take any pair of boxes that are connected to each other, any pair of lines that share the same endpoints, or you can trace a complete loop, and also between box and line, or between line and box. If there's an imbalance, so one could overwhelm the other side, where they're working at different speeds, speaking different languages, or if in some way that interaction is unfaithful, unreliable, then that describes a dysfunction, or describes the source of a dysfunction. And if you take all those possible kinds of failure and the number of different combinations of boxes and lines that we have just in this corner of the picture, multiply those two numbers together, and you get some big numbers. The ability at fine detail at any level of organization to identify dysfunction is really quite extraordinary. So as a diagnostic tool, it's very powerful. So to give you an idea of an imbalance, so if, for example, your intent is changing faster than your progress, that's a problem. If you're, for example, if you have a manager that's always changing their mind, and you never get a chance to finish anything, that is a problem. If your coordination system seems burdensome, the cost of it seems unreasonable relative to the work that you're doing, that's a problem. If you don't speak the language of the environment, that's a problem. I mean, those are just a few examples, but take pairs of elements in this diagram, look for the imbalances, and you are describing a dysfunction. Scaling that up from team level is actually pretty straightforward. So a model I'm using here is sociocracy, a very nice way of explaining how things like authority, accountability, collaboration, governance, consent, self-organization, participation, all those things very easily described just by saying that people are members of self-governing circles. They're there by consent, they govern by consent, and they can move between circles again by consent, perhaps working in multiple circles, so they're participating in multiple things, the hub of some collaboration between those circles, for example. Very elegant, very simple model, very powerful. The other thing we have to do is to make sure that the way we describe our commitments, our agenda for change, and the way we coordinate works at those levels. It works at team-to-team level as well as team level. But here's the hard part, and here's the part that scaling frameworks often get wrong. You can be careful that one level doesn't try to do the job of the other. We don't want the team-to-team levels to be micromanaging the work of the people in the teams, for example. We want to be sure that at each level, they're describing what they're trying to achieve at a level that makes sense to them, and lets the other levels describe what they're doing at a level that makes sense to them. And it's their responsibility to make sure that it all adds up. Looking down, you make sure that it adds up. Looking up, you are trying to align. So you can use tools like OKR, for example, to express some of those relationships, both what you're trying to do and how you hope to pace yourself towards where you want to get to. So that is intentful knowledge discovery, and hopping over to mutual trust building, it actually looks very similar. Now, what we're trying to do here is different, but the structures look very, very similar. So here we're about sustaining health and performance, because we're just making sure that everything is healthy, everything agrees with each other, no surprises. What we think is happening is what's happening. So reconciling, across a level between teams, for example, reconciling up and down, making sure I understand what you're trying to achieve and I understand how I'm going to contribute to that. And really all we're doing here is investing in every mechanism we think is appropriate to maximize trust. So we're not paying that cost of mistrust. We're not paying for the cost of defensiveness, information hiding, duplication of effort, and so on and so on. So we use things like transparency, inspection, assessment, which are a particular way, assessment, surveys, that kind of thing, particular tools for finding out what's going on. Inquiry, that's just, asking the right questions. Things like measuring, monitoring, metrics, dashboards, all that kind of stuff as well. All of this goes into here. And when we do these things well, they build trust. I mean, do them badly, they can have the opposite effect, but do them well, they build trust, and it works both ways. If I know that you're interested in my issues, whether or not you commit to taking them on board or not, that helps. And that works both ways. If I have some insight into your strategy, that helps to build trust. And again, that kind of, it works both ways. I'm not going to go into the details at this point. It would take a little bit too long, but again, we can ask the question, what does it look like if these boxes are inadequate, we don't have enough of these mechanisms in place, or they're in some way abusing the relationship? What's happening when these things are out of balance with each other? One particular of these tools I just want to point out is the idea of assessments. Assessments is a tool in Agenda Shift. We have a delivery assessment and also a deliberately adaptive organization assessment. And this is one, these are 5 prompts from out of 35, I think it is, for that assessment tool. And 2 of those prompts, we feel heard when we share our issues. Changes in policy or direction do not come as a surprise to those impacted by them, actually relate to the relationship between 2 of those overlapping boxes, between mutual trust building and intentful knowledge discovery. You can imagine that if people are conducting experiments that come as a surprise to you, that's not going to be helpful from a trust point of view. They might be doing something that you consider dangerous, harmful, or whatever, or at least you might be offended that you weren't consulted. And that idea that you should consult with other people, that you should collaborate with other people, socialize the experiments that you are doing, that's a very long established idea. That goes back to Lean again, to A3. And here's my A3 template. You can see at the top left, very much as an experiment with a hypothesis, top left, bottom left, explicitly a box for identifying the people that we should collaborate with as we refine and socialize the experiment before we start inflicting any harm on people, being a cause of mistrust. Even if our intentions are good, if we go about change in the wrong way, then we can very easily generate mistrust. Scaling this stuff up, pretty straightforward. The circles do a lot of the work for us. Overlaps between circles means that the information flows across levels and up and down levels straightforwardly. The trick is to know that often you need to be aware of multiple levels at the same time. So, for example, I'm sitting in a team. I might still be interested in corporate strategy, at least to the extent that I can wonder how it's going to start impacting on us. And going in the other direction, things like audits, for example, those typically start, quite high up. So quite often these mechanisms span multiple levels. So that's mutual trust building. And let's hop up now to probably the most interesting one, adaptive strategy. And some bullets here. Maintaining an adaptive existence. This is about being deliberate about being adaptive. Exploring what it means to survive and thrive amid uncertainty. And that's what the viable system model was all about from the beginning, going back to the 1970s. Asking and answering some existential questions. So like, who are we? Who do we want to be? Where are we? Where do we want to go? And what kind of shape we'll be in when we get there. So this isn't just now about doing work. We are beginning to think about the future. Everything we've covered so far has been about the here and now. What we're about to cover is starting to look forward. So let's start at the bottom with stuff we already know. We've already seen the agenda for change. It was at the top of both the previous systems that we looked at. So going left to right, the agenda for change is informed by intelligence coming from outside, by insights that we generate, insights that we draw from our intelligence and from the experiments that we've done. It's fed by the progress that we make. We can see how far we're going, what we need to do, what else we need to do to achieve our commitments, and so on. And the other way, inquiries and inspections are asking those right questions, communicating intent, what it is we want to achieve, things like objectives and goals, and of course those experiments. So what's above all this? Well, those objectives need to come from somewhere, and the learning needs to go somewhere. And the role of System 4, which is what I call it for now, so the role of System 4 is to do two things. It's to build a model of how things are, how we are as an organization, how the environment is, how the environment responds when we poke it, what the environment's expectations are of us, and so on and so on, and to worry about the future. So are we on the right path? Do we need to think about opening up some other paths? Should we actually switch paths, move on to a different one, change our objectives, or change some of the goals that take us towards our objectives? That's the job of System 4. So taking in all of that insight, all of that learning, all that intelligence, and actually using it to update its understanding of the world and itself, and to make some decisions about where we could be going and where we should be going, developing options and deciding when to exercise them. And there's still another level higher, and it's System 5 is identity, mission, and purpose. Not all possible objectives are the same. Some objectives may clash with who we think we are, what we're about, what we're doing, all those things, identity, mission, and purpose. If an objective clashes with one of those things, it needs to be resolved somehow. And most of the time, identity, mission, and purpose win. And you don't want to do things, teams don't want to do things, organizations don't want to do things that contradict its identity, its mission, and its purpose. And if that clash is serious enough, if it's important enough, then maybe it'll be resolved by a subtle change to identity or to mission or purpose. But most often, not only does that option get rejected, it never even gets suggested. We are not going to waste our time discussing options that are contrary to our identity, mission, and purpose. Now, something else to notice is the funny arrangement of arrows. This is making something very explicit. I've talked about it already. What's the right balance between delivery activities and development activities, between doing things that generate money, pay the rent, productive work, so to speak, and the still very real work of making sure that we'll be in good shape a year from now. So it might be things like developing people, looking at new technologies, coming up with new product ideas, whatever it might be. What is the right balance between learning and doing? And if you get those things out of balance, it can get horrible. I mean, I've actually worked closely, or even been a member of organizations that have got that balance wrong. Early in my career, I worked for an organization that was only developing, never actually sold anything. And that's not a great way to run a profitable business. And conversely, I've been in organizations that were only about living from day to day, and that gets pretty tiresome pretty quickly. And people don't want to hang around in organizations that aren't developing because they won't throw up new and interesting challenges. So one other function of System 5 is, call it mood or mode. It's you may not realize it until it's pointed out to you, but organizations go through different moods and modes. So for example, at the end of the year, and there's a lot of focus on tidying up, clearing and making sure all the books are tidy and all the rest of it. When the organization is under threat, or where the opportunity is massive, and it needs to be super focused on whatever the threat or the opportunity is. And at other times, it wants to relax constraints. It wants some innovation. It wants 1,000 flowers to bloom. That's a very different mood, and it may go from one mood to the other surprisingly rapidly, depending on what's happening in the environment. And it's nearly Christmas. Even like Christmas party time. We relax a bit in December, perhaps. And that's something that kind of goes across the whole organization. This in the model is system 5. It's something that all organisms do, but organizations do it too. So plugging in some of and that has an effect on the intentful knowledge discovery part. So if we're focused, that needs to have an effect on how we coordinate. Make sure we're coordinating only on the important things, making sure we're only doing the important things, making sure all the distractions are put to one side. So calibrations like that, policy adjustments, these are things that don't happen a lot. We're not interfering, not tampering with the system, but we're just providing the right level of constraint so that the business operates at the right level of energy and focus for the situation. So plugging in some tools, the strategy, performance and alignment review, otherwise known as the outside in service delivery review, you may have read it as that, and the outside in strategy review and other strategy reviews that I've described, both of them well described in both of the later books. So right to left takes the more operational view of these reviews. Agenda Shift is looking at it very much from an organization development point of view, and both of them actually are very interested in identifying the leadership opportunities in both of those things. In terms of scaling, straightforward enough. If you accept that at every level there needs to be some strategy. It's one of the ironies of Agile, not just scaled Agile, I would perhaps especially scaled Agile, but Agile in general, talk a lot about team autonomy, and yet strategy is something that happens to them. And I think this is desperately sad. And we need to give, wherever we want to see, a team of teams with identity and purpose of its own, it also has to have some strategy of its own. Now, that doesn't mean that it doesn't also speak to the strategies of the levels above. And the fun part, and it is genuinely fun when you get this right, is making sure you're having the right conversations between levels, giving people the opportunity to participate in higher level strategy, giving at lower levels, making sure that everyone has the opportunity to articulate strategy in their own words, and the conversations are there to make sure that what happens at one level aligns up to what's needed at the level above. It's not a cascade process, it's a conversation, it's a negotiation, and it reflects the autonomy at every level with appropriate attention to alignment, to coherence, those kind of things. Hard-ish thing to get right. Once you've broken the mental barrier that you should open the door and encourage some conversations, get the right people into the room, maybe three levels of seniority, 3 levels of organization represented in the room at the same time, then it gets a whole lot easier. So I said just we get towards the end that I wanted to address a common misunderstanding of these kinds of models, management cybernetics generally, viable system model in particular. I don't consider myself a member of the management cybernetics community, but I think this work is important, and it's why I'm very happy to both use it and to share it, and also to dispel a common misconception. There's a misconception that it's all about control. The idea that the CEO sitting in his glass office just has to press a few buttons, pull a few levers, and the organization is going to come in behind him, is going to control what everyone's doing, is going to control the environment and get the result that he wanted. I mean, nobody thinks that's realistic. Certainly no one thinks that's realistic when you consider the diversity of people in organizations, the diversity of teams in organizations, and the fact that they are made of real human beings with autonomy, their own idea of purpose, their own desires, all of those kinds of things. You just can't do it. And I actually think the great thing that the management cybernetics community did was actually show that the math shows that it's basically impossible. Actually, the maths is actually pretty straightforward. I mean, I studied maths at university. I did a little bit of control theory. And one of the first things that you learn that there are some very simple, very linear systems that still aren't controllable. So if you can't control even a simple linear system, what can you do? What does doing your best look like? And doing your best looks something like this, and it's very well supported in the model, and it very well aligns with some other models of organization and of leadership and of complexity and so on that you might be familiar with. So the idea going down the middle, that a leader's responsibility, or one of their key responsibilities, is to represent intent. That's pretty well understood. You represent intent and you let smart people respond to it. And that scales really, really well. Building trust scales really, really well. That doesn't mean you aren't sort of shining the spotlight around from time to time, using your spare capacity to understand what's going on at a level or two below you in the organization. But you're doing that in the expectation that what you're going to like, what you're going to see. And the exercise is for the purpose of building trust, not to find fault. And on the right, managing constraints, making sure there's the right level of focus. And that's something that's dynamic. You know, there are times when we need to be utterly focused. There are times when we need to step back, relax the constraints, let that innovation happen, and so on. And instead of the organization being something that just does the bidding of the senior leadership, we see organizations as they really are, as diverse, with great opportunity for self-governance, self-organization, and self-development as well. The organization developing itself and the people within it also having the opportunity to develop. Which leads me to the human scale. We've scaled up from up through team of teams, up to the enterprise, scaling down to the human level. And I kind of want to make this about you and about me. So what's your agenda for change? Now talking in career terms now. What's your focus? How narrow, how wide is that focus? Is your strategy to go broad, to learn as much as you can about as many different things, or is it to go deep somewhere? I'm not judging here. Both strategies can work really well. Are you authentic? When I say authentic, you know, as a leader, are you honest about the dysfunctions around you? You know, those that are within your sphere of influence, at least. Are you honest with yourself about how you react to them? Are you honest with yourself about how you react to the challenges around you? Are you honest with yourself about the change that's happening? And change really is inevitable. But are you honest with your reactions to whatever change happens to be in the air at the moment? And here's the thing. If you can't trust your own reactions, if you can't trust yourself, how can you expect others to trust you? So getting that authenticity right is often the place to start if you want to start working on yourself as a leader. And then you can start thinking more developmentally. How am I going to evolve? How am I going to develop in my role, in my career as a person? What's my responsibility to others to help them? Am I helping them settle into their roles, to grow into their roles, to find new opportunities from that same role or somewhere else in the organization? Are other people helping me do that? What's their responsibility to me for that, or what opportunity do I see for that? Am I helped to reappraise my relationship with the organization? You know, perhaps helping understand a way the organization could change, or a way that I could change. And do I understand my responsibilities to help other people do those same things? So that is the deliberately developmental organization. That's the model there. It fits really well into the viable system model and the deliberately adaptive organization. It's Keegan and Leahy. And if you go to deliberately adaptive org, the link at the bottom there, you'll see a link to that book and some of the others that I mentioned. So that's up and down the deliberately adaptive organization, business agility at every scale. And having something that works at every scale for me is far more interesting than taking a team level process and scaling it up, making it more complicated, making it heavier, and making it one where strategy is something that happens to you. Now, I'm not saying don't use an agile process framework. I'm not saying don't scale. I'm saying use the models to help you. Use the models to help you find the dysfunctions you have already, the dysfunctions that a framework may or may not help you with dysfunctions that perhaps a framework may even make worse. So it really helps to understand the theory and to be serious about the things that aren't quite working in your organization, and not expecting a process framework to solve all of them for you. Not all the problems I described, in fact, probably most of the problems I described, they're not process problems, they're organizational problems. They're about how things relate to each other. They're how people relate to each other, how the components of the organization relate to each other. And that's a slightly different thing, the process. So last two chapters of the second edition, that's where to find the most in-depth description of this stuff at the moment. To go back to the theory, Stafford Beer's books, I read all of these at least once. Some of them I read 2 or 3 times. We're talking 1,500 pages or something of some quite, not always easy, I've got to say, these textbooks. Much easier book is written by a friend of mine, Patrick Hoverstadt, The Fractal Organization, and I would recommend that as a first place to look if you're interested in the viable system model. On the website, deliberatelyadaptive.org, you'll see links to other books I mentioned. So there's Keegan and Leahy that I mentioned, and Everyone Culture is the name of that book. And there's also links to the other resources that I mentioned. And just as I finish, do also follow the Agenda Shift Academy on LinkedIn. We're about to launch some new stuff that will make a difference in this kind of space. And on that note, I will leave it there. And I'm open back to the chair, and I'm open for questions. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Mike. Now, what to say? No questions. Nobody has dropped any questions. So I will try to give it a go.
Yeah.
I have this long-held fantasy that an enterprise is like a person, in the sense that it has a mind, it has a soul. It can. It doesn't have to. It's not an obligation. But actually, it's an organization, right? We use these metaphors like organs, organizations, as if we are some biological structure, biological living system. Now, obviously, everything is grounded in system thinking, but I like something even more interesting. The way you describe things is a bit like an anatomical lesson on how how the entire thing works, and in that sense, it's a bit of a renaissance. I keep saying this word. I like to use this word, especially in the context of digital transformation, because a person is one thing, Homo erectus, and then Homo sapiens. Now Homo industrialis and Homo digitalis. Right now we are talking about, before even coming to agile transformation, we also have this use of data. And here I want to use some word that you are probably familiar with from the classic books: sense making. Organization as a single body that looks into its environment and sees it as a threat, as an opportunity. Because our conference is about opportunities, right? So as a strategy consultant, what I learned is you should never you can describe the threat, but you should always find ways of converting that into an opportunity. And I think this is what makes strategy a worthy profession. Otherwise, we are not here just to enhance competition, right? We are here to get better. So in the sense that we are in the age of disruption, you also know the literature on build to last, right? Unfortunately, we are mortal. In a way, living organizations are mortal. We are not designed to survive forever. So in this sense of architecturing, I think you are doing what the Renaissance painters has done. Look at the organization with the right perspective so that it can be understood better. And today we had Alok, my friend, who's talking about design and how to make designs of anything, even our own profession. How can we redesign the project management? So based on your knowledge of the current practice of project management, what would you say that we have to change in the way that we are educating ourselves? Should we unlearn something? Should we stop doing something so that we could be as good as those Renaissance painters and reinvent the human design, make the organization
Yes.
great again. This is what I call.
Yes. Yes.
Could you
Yes.
give us some comment on how
I
can
want to
we
do that.
be
And
more human?
I might flick around between a few of these slides as well. So just to go back to your thing about the relationship between this model and the human. I think we share a goal of making organizations feel more human, humanizing them, as a colleague of mine describes it. But actually, the human was actually the archetype for the viable system model.
Yep.
If you read Brain of the Firm, it's basically goes down to the level of the human nervous system, afferent and efferent nerves, and incoming and outgoing signals, and everything that we do to make sure that when our finger moves to touch our nose, it actually does hit our nose and not pokes us in the eye. All that stuff. The intent, the feedback, all that stuff is very much based on a biological metaphor, not a machine metaphor. Another sort of big misunderstanding of the of the cyberneticists. In terms of what lessons are there for project management community, I think I'd like to go to actually several of the slides when I talked about scaling. I talk about some of the things that go wrong, and there are two things that help to fix them. And I've mentioned one of them, but I mention it again, but I'll mention another one, which goes back to what Agenda Shift is all about. So one thing I'd mention is don't underestimate the power of participation, getting the right people in the room, very often 3 levels of people into the room and actually having a conversation. And the way that we describe what we're trying to achieve, the way we understand how different levels and different teams across the level are going to contribute to that. There is no substitute for getting people into a room. And the other thing is principle number 1 for Agenda Shift, which I didn't have a slide for. This wasn't a slide about Agenda Shift. But principle number 1 is agreement on outcomes before solutions. And it does go actually with this slide. Agreement on outcomes before solutions, the intent rather than the dictating the design. Agreements and outcomes before solutions is a massive change for change management, if nothing else, but it's a massive change for how leaders communicate as well. And actually wanting authentic agreement, right people in the room, meaningful outcomes, and those outcomes being meaningful, needs met, happy endings to stories, all that kind of stuff, stops us being just about numbers, just about targets, and not about pushing unwanted solutions on people. Too much of the change management industry, I'm not going to blame all project managers, but too much of the change management industry is fixated on a model of change formalized in the 1990s that is about selling solutions with outcomes, rolling them out, living with the usually disappointing consequences. What if we used outcomes to find solutions? That makes it a much more granular thing. And if you've got agreements on outcomes, you've got people motivated to find those solutions. It's a complete 180-degree turnaround, the relationship between solutions and outcomes. It's a paradigm shift, honestly. And if we can start to change the way we have conversations about outcomes and have strategy conversations about outcomes, which is what most of my work is about, that I believe is a game changer.
If you twist this a little bit for our, let's say, professional development, in terms of for our project managers who are usually sitting in the PMO, let's say ideally, because you are describing an ideal organization, and let's say PMO is working for the SMO. Strategy is well defined and we know the intent. And now we need to execute. Here, I think there are maybe different modes of operation as well. You cannot just execute once, right? It has to be maybe operational. So how do you translate the strategic design into a better operational design? Let's call it customer-centric or another organization. But the point is, strategy should not be about the operation, right? It shouldn't, let's say, interfere with the serving the customer services, let's say day-to-day operations. So first of all, what would you put on the strategic agenda? That is, I think, looking outside and achieving better results in the environment. But what if the strategy also included self-transformation, transforming the organization?
Absolutely. So you need, there's actually two kinds of strategy that complement each other. They're not opposed to each other, inside out and outside in. So inside out, if you're doing something like an agile retrospective, for example, you can very easily translate that into strategy. Inside out strategy starts with us, our experience, what we're able to do, how we do things, how well we do things, and works from that inside to the impact we're able to have on the outside world. And as we develop our capabilities, we actually create new opportunities. And that takes us to outside in strategy. Outside in starts with our customer, their needs, their struggles, their wants, their desires. It starts with our competitors and their competing strategies that we've got to be aware of and perhaps maneuver relative to or maneuver against. We've got our suppliers, we've got all sorts of regulators, all sorts of other stakeholders. Understand what an idealized design would look like from that perspective, how we would want to be perceived as an organization, how we want to perceive ourselves, what that means for products and services, what that means for the platform with which we deliver those products and services, and so on. We're working our way back inwards to our experience, our capability, and so on. So there's a cycle. These feed off each other.
Can we also wrap up, because we have like a few minutes left, on the
Yes.
learning? Let's say
Yes.
maybe you have. Can you tell us from practice, if you are working any organizations with any organizations in this way of thinking,
Yeah.
have you reached this ideal state where we can then talk about learning? I mean, you're familiar with the balanced scorecard framework.
Yeah. We never quite reach a balance, that ideal state, but certainly learning's been a big focus of mine for a long time. I mean, that's why I invented the change band game, for example. But in the what used to call it the outside in service delivery review, we now call the strategy, performance, and alignment review. I actually was doing this for real in government digital quite a few years ago now, and this was a regular review where we started with our objectives. Then we looked at what the numbers were telling us, and then we looked at our experiments, what we'd learned from our recently completed experiments, what we're trying to learn now, what's next on the agenda. And we started, the reason it's called outside in is because we started with the customer. We started with, for example, a report from the service delivery desk. We started with user research and other things that other customer-related things that the product folks looked after. Then we looked at the organisation. I actually had my senior, sponsor. Then gave the next update, not the first update, the second update. We started with the customer, then the organisation, then it was product, platform, teams.
Yes, but is the learning component inside the strategy unit, not in the rest of the organization, just in the strategy part?
Yeah, that's where these overlapping circles concern, because enough of the people that were in that meeting were also, also participated in the strategy, the level up.
What I mean is this: can we not have also another part of the cycle about unlearning? I'm thinking, because beer is showing this mechanical engine. We should have this reverse gear as well, and pull back sometimes.
Yeah, exactly. So, from Lean Startup, you have the pivot, for example, and you're saying, actually, that track we're going down isn't the right one. We need to find another. And we might end up being a completely different organization if we go down that path, rightly or wrongly. So that's kind of in the language of stuff I've shared already today. There's also, coming from Keegan and Leahy, so the same people that did the deliberately developmental organization did immunity to change. Another really interesting model, and that's about recognizing that even when we think we really want to do something, to achieve something, to change some behavior, very often we are very committed to some other behavior for some reason that we don't yet fully understand, and actually digging into those and thinking about challenging the hypotheses that underpin those unwanted, opposite, unhelpful behaviors is quite a useful discipline for unlearning. So that's that model, and there's a great book, Immunity to Change.
Interestingly, we have tomorrow a session on corporate venturing, And actually, he's my first boss. He's my first manager who hired me the first time, and he wrote like 7 books on startups. And basically, the title says very explicitly what the corporations can learn from startups. And it's very interesting that startup could actually be a limited risk learning experiment, because you could just invest a little bit, not too much, see if it works, and then you can decide to grow it or keep it small.
That's what was so exciting about Government Digital a few years ago. So in the UK, we were running Lean Startup essentially inside government departments and government agencies, and very quickly, in weeks and months, delivering services that were massively better than the services that were there before. That model really does work.
So these little experiments, whether you call it startups or pilot projects, actually it's part of the strategic learning process, right?
Absolutely, yes. As the model says, frame, and you do anything new, frame it as an experiment, and regardless of whether it succeeds or fail, frame it so that you're guaranteed to learn something.
I think we cannot have strategy without experimentation, hypothesis testing. Otherwise, it is just a dictated form of plan. It's just another plan, basically.
Well, if nothing else, you are leaving so much value on the table if, when you're doing new things, you're not learning in the process. That's just a criminal waste.
All right, Mike. Thank you so much. I see you in the Kanban panel. I think we are going to have a lively discussion there as well. Now,
look forward to that.
What I recommend is I was asking for a question, and instead of question, I got this remark that actually we need to digest all this, because Ekaterina says this is all new to her, but actually this is very old literature, in fact. But
a lot of great stuff comes from the 70s. It was the golden age for systems thinking and organization development, and I'm still mining that stuff now.
I know, Mike. I'm as old as you, so we are digging. This is why I think it's Renaissance.
Yes.
All right, let's not get lost. Thank you so much, and I'll see you again.
See you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Ciao.